The street was always the same, narrow, cobbled, worn by time. Its stones carried the shuffle of hurried feet, the occasional laughter of children, the echo of distant horns, but not hers. Clara walked it every evening as if drifting through a faded painting. Her steps were silent, deliberate, and always alone. She kept to the left side of the street, where the trees bent toward the buildings like tired old men, shedding crisp amber leaves onto the pavement like forgotten letters. She didn't look up, not at the windows above her, not at the couples passing by, not at the blur of the world that moved as if she weren't even there. Clara was in her late 30s, though she seemed older in the way some women do, not in her face, but in her silence. Her brown hair was usually pinned back in a simple twist, practical and unbothered. She wore the same navy blue coat every day, frayed at the cuffs, buttoned all the way to her chin, as if to seal something in. Her hands were always tucked inside her pockets, even when it wasn't quite cold enough to justify it. She worked at a small, independent bookstore tucked between a bakery and a dry cleaner. The owner rarely spoke unless necessary, and Clara preferred it that way. She shelved new titles with the quiet reverence of someone tending graves, arranging each spine like it mattered. When the last customer left and the bell above the door stopped chiming, she'd lock up, pull her scarf tighter, and begin the long walk home. Every day she passed the same corner, and every day he was there. The beggar sat beneath a crooked lamppost, his body hunched like a question mark, a threadbare gray blanket wrapped around his shoulders. His beard was scraggly, white threaded with shadow. His eyes, deep, heavy, and unblinking, were always fixed on her. He never asked for anything. Not a coin, not a smile, not even mercy. He simply watched her pass like she was a story he had read before, one he could not stop reading again. Clara noticed, of course. How could she not? But she never acknowledged him. Not with her eyes, not with a nod. She pretended he wasn't there, just as the rest of the city did. Yet something about his stare clung to her long after she'd turned the corner. At night, when the apartment's silence became too loud, she would sit by the window with a book she wouldn't read. The wind outside would rattle the glass, and sometimes in the reflection of the pane, she imagined his eyes, still watching, still waiting. She didn't know why he stared. She didn't want to know, because knowing might mean remembering, and remembering meant opening a door she had long ago sealed shut. But that door, like the cold wind and the man beneath the lamppost, was patient, and winter was coming. It happened on a Thursday. The sky had bruised over with swollen gray clouds, and the wind whispered of rain. Clara wrapped her coat tighter, her scarf tugged higher up her neck. Her footsteps tapped the wet cobblestones as usual, calm and unhurried, her eyes on the cracks ahead, not on the world around her, until she passed the corner, until he nodded. It was subtle, a small tilt of his chin, so faint it could have been imagined. But she felt it, a shift in the atmosphere, like a string had been tugged inside her chest. His eyes didn't just watch her that day, they held her, longer than usual, like they knew something she didn't, like they were waiting. Clara's breath caught. She didn't return the gesture. She didn't even slow down. But her pace quickened as she turned the corner, almost tripping over her own feet. Her heart was beating harder than the moment deserved, as if some old instinct had been triggered, the kind that lived in the bones, not the brain. Back in her apartment, she lit a candle she hadn't used in months. Its scent, sandalwood and ash, filled the room like memory. She curled into the armchair beside the window, her book unopened on her lap. Her eyes kept drifting to the darkened street below, searching for... what? That night's sleep came slow and uneasy, and with it, him, her brother. He was 10 again, standing in the kitchen with peanut butter smeared across his cheeks, laughing at something she couldn't remember. His voice echoed in the dream like wind through a broken door. Clara was younger, too, softer, lighter. She reached out to him, called his name, Thomas, but he didn't answer. He only stared. And in his eyes were his eyes, the beggar's, deep, sad, knowing. She jolted awake, breath ragged, the sheets tangled around her legs. The room was still, save for the ticking of the old clock on the bookshelf. But something inside her was moving now, something that hadn't stirred in years. She sat there in the dark for a long time, staring at her reflection in the window, trying to shake the image from her mind. But it clung to her, the way dreams sometimes do, stubborn and sticky, long after dawn. It wasn't just a stare anymore. It was a question, a whisper from the past, and it was beginning to demand an answer. She tried not to look at him. At first it was instinct, the way she'd always averted her gaze, kept her head down, passed without pause. But something had changed since the dream, since Thomas's eyes had looked through hers with a stranger's sorrow, since the beggar's nod had cracked the icy mirror she lived inside. Now Clara saw more than she wanted to. His coat, thinner than it had any right to be, clung to him like tissue in the wind. His shoes were torn at the toes, stuffed with something, plastic maybe, or crumpled newspaper. His fingers, long and dirt-worn, trembled slightly as he held his blanket around himself. His lips were always pale, his face gaunt, his presence quiet, but unmistakably human. One day as the bookstore closed early for inventory, Clara walked into the bakery next door. Her hands moved almost on their own. A simple sandwich, ham and cheese, no condiments. She hesitated at the door of the shop, the brown paper bag sweating faintly in her palm. Her heart beat faster with every step toward the street corner, as if she were about to commit some unspeakable act. When she reached him, he didn't look up right away. His eyes were half shut, lost in some private ache. Clara stood there, awkward and unsure, for longer than she meant to. Then, without a word, she placed the sandwich beside him and turned to leave. But his eyes opened. They met hers. There was no smile, no expression of surprise or gratitude. Just a stillness. Wide brown eyes, soft with something that caught her off guard. Not pity, not need, recognition. She left quickly, but the next day she brought another, this time an apple. The day after, soup in a thermos wrapped in a dish towel. Each offering felt clumsy, like a child fumbling through a language she no longer spoke. He never asked, never spoke. But he nodded now, always, and held her gaze as if they were sharing something far older than words. A ritual bloomed between them in the brittle frost of late autumn. And one morning, after setting down a cup of tea in a chipped ceramic mug she no longer used, Clara smiled. It was small, a flicker, but it was real. The first smile in years. Days passed. Sometimes on quiet afternoons, she found herself thinking about him. The way he sat, the way his fingers trembled a little less, the way the color had begun returning to his cheeks. She began to speak, just fragments, snippets from the bookstore, a strange customer, a misprinted cover, the smell of old paper. He listened, silently, always, until one day as she turned to leave, she heard it. Software gravelly, almost wind-blown. Clara. She froze. The world seemed to still with her. Her name hung in the air like smoke. She turned, but he said nothing more, only nodded gently, and she knew something had shifted again. The wall between them had begun to crack. The first whisper came from across the hallway. Clara was fumbling with her keys when Mrs. Ellings, her elderly neighbor with sharp eyes and a tongue like vinegar, stepped out of her apartment holding a bag of trash. "That man you keep feeding," she said, as if continuing a conversation they'd never started. "You know who he is, don't you?" Clara turned, startled. What?" "The beggar, on the corner. Don't act like you don't see him. He's been there for years. Never speaks. Just watches." Mrs. Ellings shook her head, her lips pursed like she'd tasted something bitter. "They say he used to be in prison. Something not right in the head. Cops won't touch him anymore. Everyone avoids him for a reason, dear." Clara managed a polite nod, muttered something vague, and closed her door with trembling fingers. But the words sank their claws in. Not right. Prison. Dangerous. At the bookstore the next day, it only worsened. Clara had left a paper bag in the break room by mistake. A sandwich, an apple, a thermos. A co-worker, Lila, found it and teased her with a wink. "Packing lunch for your mystery man, Clara?" Clara froze. "Excuse me?" Lila laughed. "Come on, we've seen you. You leave every day at the same time and take the long way home. We figured there must be some secret crush. Turns out it's just, what, a homeless guy? Another chimed in. You always did like broken things. Clara said nothing, just gathered her things, left early, and walked home under a sky that looked like it had forgotten how to shine. Shame curled in her gut like smoke. What had felt sacred now felt exposed, distorted. The fragile bond she'd built, now mocked, misunderstood. She avoided the corner that night, taking the longer route home. The streets on that path were brighter, busier. She told herself it was safer. Logical, but it felt wrong. The next day she avoided it again, and the day after. Each evening her chest ached with something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't fear, not of him at least. It was something worse. Guilt. She began to dream again, but the dreams were colder now, sharper. She saw Thomas, not laughing in the kitchen this time, but standing on the edge of the lake, his back to her, his small hands clenched into fists. She was calling out to him, louder, more desperate, but he didn't turn around. And when she finally reached him, when she touched his shoulder and he spun to face her, it wasn't Thomas. It was the man, the beggar, his face soaked with rain, his eyes full of sorrow. And he whispered, "Why did you leave me?" Clara woke with a strangled cry, drenched in sweat, the sheets twisted around her like rope. It had been years since that day, since Thomas disappeared without a trace, since the police had combed the woods, the water, the quiet town, and found nothing but silence. But the grief had never gone, only buried. Now it was clawing its way back to the surface, and the man on the corner, somehow, impossibly, was tied to it. The cold had turned sharper, soaked in winter's early promise. Clara stood at the edge of the street corner, her breath clouding the air, eyes scanning the small square of pavement as if he might reappear from the shadows. But the space where he used to sit, bundled in his thin coat, fingers trembling, eyes watching, was empty. She waited. Minutes passed, then hours. People moved around her, indifferent, fast, wrapped in lives she could no longer touch. The city went on, but the man was gone. The next day she returned. Still nothing. No trace. No signs. No crumbs from yesterday's bread. No cup resting beside the fire hydrant. Not even the faint, familiar scent of unwashed wool and old smoke. But Clara came again. She brought food, a sandwich wrapped carefully in parchment, an apple, and a thermos filled with the tea he liked best. She placed them where he used to sit, arranged them with the same quiet ritual they had built together. And she walked away. She did this again the next day, and the one after that. It became a new kind of ritual, one built not on presence but on absence, until the fifth night. It rained hard, a cold, merciless rain that soaked through coats and cracked umbrellas. Clara still came, still left the food, still waited for a while under the awning of the shop across the street. And that night when she returned after closing the bookstore, she saw the sandwich, untouched, soggy, flattened. The apple rolled a few inches away, bruised from the rain. The thermos had tipped over, spilling lukewarm tea across the curb like blood. She stared at it, then dropped to her knees. The tears came suddenly, not in soft waves but in violent, aching sobs. Her hands clutched the soaked sandwich like it could somehow bring him back. But it wasn't just him she was mourning. It was everything. Every unspoken word. Every kindness too late. Every buried memory clawing its way up like thorns through skin. She wept on the pavement, unaware of the people staring as they passed. She didn't care. She couldn't stop, because the truth had become unbearably clear. She had needed him, not for rescue, not for pity, but because in his silence he had seen her. Not the Clara who kept her head down, not the Clara who smiled politely and disappeared into routine, but the Clara who still carried a boy's name like a wound, who still woke to empty rooms and unanswered questions. That night, soaked and shivering, she went home and opened the box. It had been hidden in her closet for over a decade, a small wooden thing, smooth from years of being ignored. Inside, her brother's letters, short notes, scribbled drawings, and beneath them, something she'd forgotten existed. A newspaper clipping, yellowed now, edges curled. Teen boy missing, last seen near Central Station. Clara stared at the headline, then at the date, and the place, Central Station, the same street where the man had always sat. The next morning, Clara sat at her kitchen table with a worn leather-bound journal open before her, untouched since she was 19. The pen in her hand felt foreign, too heavy, like it carried all the words she had never said. She stared at the blank page, and then slowly she wrote, "It rained the day Thomas disappeared." The ink trembled, but the words came easier after the first. She wrote about the laughter that echoed in the halls before silence took its place, about the way she used to chase him through the house, barefoot and breathless, about the last thing she said to him, "Stop being annoying," words she had carried like a curse for years, page after page, no edits, no censoring, just the quiet purge of a wound long sealed, but never healed. That afternoon she walked, not to the bookstore, not to the street corner, but to Central Station. It hadn't changed much. The pigeons still fluttered around the benches. The vending machine still hummed. The arrivals board flickered with train times, destinations she had never taken. She stood near the west platform, where the article had said Thomas was last seen. Her fingers grazed the rusted railing. She let the memory come. That day, that cold, that hour, when he had said he wanted to see the trains. She had let him go ahead. Just for a minute, just long enough to tie her shoe, and then he was gone. Her legs gave slightly beneath her, and she sat on the bench. People moved around her, but the silence inside was vast. In her mind, she spoke to him. "Why did you stare at me like that? Why didn't you speak sooner? How did you know my name?" There were no answers, just the imagined echo of the man's eyes. Kind, tired, knowing. And Clara finally understood. It had never been about charity, not pity, not guilt. Feeding him was the first thing she had done outside of the grief that caged her. It was the first real gesture of connection. Fragile, human, alive. She hadn't saved him. He had saved her, piece by piece, bite by bite, silence by silence. As she sat in that station, a strange warmth bloomed in her chest, the kind that doesn't come from victory or certainty, but from release. She no longer felt ashamed, not of her past, not of her tears, and not of the strange, wordless bond she had formed with the man the world had cast aside. Because in a city full of ghosts, they had seen each other, and that, she finally believed, mattered. It was a Sunday morning when the letter arrived, slipped through the door without a sound, resting quietly atop a pile of forgotten bills and supermarket flyers. Clara wouldn't have noticed it if not for the weight. It was heavier than paper should be. No stamp, no return address, just her name, handwritten in a jagged scrawl that sent a shiver through her. She opened it with trembling fingers. Inside, folded carefully, was a photograph. Old, faded at the edges. The kind of photo that smelled like dust and memory. It was her, 15, in a blue jacket, sitting cross-legged on the front porch of their childhood home. Beside her, a boy no older than 10, laughing, his arm draped around her shoulders like it was the most natural thing in the world. Thomas. She hadn't seen this photo in years. It wasn't from any family album. This one, she didn't remember being taken. On the back, written in rough black ink, "I watched you for years because I couldn't face you." Her breath caught in her throat. Time stopped. It can't be. Clara stood so quickly, her chair toppled behind her. The letter still clutched in her hand, she threw on her coat and ran, faster than she had in decades. Down the stairs, into the street, through the biting wind. She didn't stop until she reached the shelter near the south end of town, the one tucked behind the church, the one she had passed 100 times but never noticed. The woman at the front desk was kind, middle-aged, with crow's feet and gentle eyes. Clara's voice shook. "I'm looking for someone. He may have stayed here." Thin, graying hair, trembles in his hands. He sits on 9th Street. Doesn't speak much. He stares." The woman's eyes lit with recognition. "Oh, you mean Thomas?" Clara's knees buckled. The receptionist came around the desk, steadying her. He was with us for a while. Quiet man, sweet in his own way. Never caused trouble. Checked out last week, though. Left a few things behind. Said someone finally saw him again. Clara's lips parted, but no words came. Her mind reeled. Thomas. Thomas was the man. The man she had passed 100 times. The man who never spoke. The man who stared. Because he remembered. Because he knew. Because for years he had lived on the edge of her world. Watching, ashamed, lost inside a mind frayed by time and trauma. And when she finally looked back, when she saw him not as a beggar, but as a person, something shifted. He had known her name. He had whispered it not by chance, but because it was his to say. He had forgiven her before she had even known what she needed forgiveness for. But maybe more than that, he had finally forgiven himself. Clara sat on the shelter's worn couch, hands cradling the photograph like it was holy. Tears rolled down her cheeks, silent and warm. He had been alive all along, not whole, not unbroken, but there. And in the end, when the silence between them cracked, it wasn't tragedy that poured out. It was love, wounded, wandering, but waiting to be seen. The wind carried a bitter chill as Clara stepped onto 9th Street. The same street, the same corner. But this time, she didn't walk past. She stopped. She sat, right where he used to be. The pavement was cold beneath her, seeping through her coat. The stone wall behind her scratched against her back, but she didn't move. People walked by, hurried, distracted, eyes forward. A few glanced at her, curious, cautious, but none stopped. Most looked away the way she once had. But Clara, she looked at them and saw them. The young man with bloodshot eyes holding his backpack like armor. The mother dragging a screaming toddler, exhaustion stitched into every muscle of her face. The old woman clutching a paper bag like it might vanish if she blinked. They were all passing through, like ghosts with unfinished stories. And for the first time in her life, Clara wasn't invisible, not to herself. The ache in her chest was still there, but it didn't swallow her. It pulsed like a heartbeat. Proof that she was still here. She returned every week after that, not to sit, but to serve. At the shelter, she brought books from the store. Stories of escape, healing, wonder. She brought food warm and simple, wrapped with care. But more than that, she brought herself, present, open. She listened. She remembered names. She laughed sometimes. And every now and then, she swore she saw his eyes in another. That same depth of sorrow, of remembering. Thomas never came back. She searched, asked around, left notes. But he remained a shadow, slipping back into the folds of the city like a dream dissolving at dawn. And yet, she didn't feel empty. She didn't need to hold him to know he had been real. He had come back in the only way he could. Long enough to be seen, long enough to see her, long enough to save her. She kept the photograph framed by her bed. Her and Thomas, side by side in a world that had vanished, but never truly left. And sometimes, when the night grew still, and the wind howled like memory, Clara would close her eyes and whisper into the dark, "Thank you for finding your way back to me, because sometimes the ones we lose return in silence, just long enough to save us." If this story touched your heart, comment, "I felt it."